very much. Okay, well, there are two big questions of war and peace that we are going to face and are already facing in the next weeks and months, and both are likely to come up as debates and votes in Parliament this autumn and at some point in 2016. The first is whether there will be an extension, at least publicly, of the current UK participation in the bombing of Iraq, where they have 8 Tornado jets currently, to Syria. The second is the question of the renewal and extension for another 30, 40 years of the Trident nuclear missile programme. In other words, whether Britain is going to remain one of the world's 9 nuclear-armed states. Both these questions are coming up, and both are likely to have votes in Parliament. Both occur, of course, in a context where we now, as leader of the Labour Party, have Jeremy Corbyn, who was, of course, elected on that huge mandate, 60% of the vote, obviously on an anti-austerity programme, but actually also on an anti-war programme. Opposition to Trident, opposition to NATO, opposition to more bombing and more wars in the Middle East. In many ways, Corbyn's whole rise was a rebellion against the way in which the sort of New Labour, Tony Blair years, was so committed, Iraq above all else, to that alliance with US imperialism. There's a rebellion against that whole feeling. And again, people probably know this, but it's worth just saying. I mean, Corbyn was, until he was elected as Labour Party leader a few weeks ago, was the chair of the Stop the War coalition. He marched against the Iraq war in 2003 at that huge 2 million strong demonstration in Hyde Park. He was one of the speakers. And he's been a long-standing member of CMD, a long-standing public opponent of nuclear weapons, and again, I think he's currently a vice chair of CMD. And when he was directly asked a couple of weeks ago on a radio interview, Mr. Corbyn, if you were Prime Minister of this country, would you ever, under any circumstances, press the button on the Trident nuclear bomb? He gave an admirably unambiguous and clear answer: no, I wouldn't. That, of course, led to a huge furore, and it's one of the central lines of the Tory attack on him. What was Cameron saying up the road in the Tory party conference? You know, Corbyn has fallen prey to, what was it, a Britain-hating, terrorist-sympathising ideology. He's a threat to national security. In other words, this has become one of the central questions in British politics. We'll come back to some of the politics around this. First, I just want to say a few things about Trident, because it seems to me that we've had very little public debate about this for decades. We are now suddenly having a public debate. What are the facts? Britain's nuclear missiles are contained in 4 submarines, 4 Vanguard submarines. Just let people come in. Hiya. Let Mark organise.
I'll pause, sorry.
Thank you.
You get a chair there? Is there a chair there?
No, you sit here, that's what Alex is doing.
How are you?
I'll get grab a couple of
No,
chairs.
sorry, you stay there, I'll do it there, okay.
Oh, sorry. Right, I'll carry on. So I'm just talking about the Trident nuclear weapon. Britain, I don't know if people know, there's 4 submarines that have nuclear arms, nuclear weapons, and one of them is always at sea. This is due for renewal through Parliament in 2016. Each submarine carries up to 40 missiles. Each warhead in those missiles is 8 times as powerful as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. That bomb in 1945 in Japan killed 145,000 people. Each nuclear weapon in these submarines is 8 times more powerful than that. Now, if you're talking about a weapon that can kill over 1 million people, let's be clear, that is not simply aimed at the political elite of some foreign power or at their military. That is a weapon targeting the civilian population. It's a weapon of mass destruction. There is no equivocation about it. It's also worth saying that the cost of renewing is staggering. 100 billion. The truth is, I don't really believe that figure. Right? the Ministry of Defence has a long history of saying something will cost something, and it turns out that the cost is 2 or 3 times higher. I mean, let me be clear: if it cost 100 million or £100, I'll still be against it. But the cost in a time when we're told we have to tighten our belts and austerity, not enough money for that, is staggering, and is one of the arguments that we can and should make against it. We're told that the Trident missile programme is because it's about Britain needing an independent deterrent. That word deterrent, it's a bit like Ministry of Defence. It's what you could call an ideological mystification. It's not, this is a weapon of aggression, of domination, about entrenching Britain's power at the top of the pecking order of imperialist states that can dominate the world. The reality is the existence of nuclear weapons increases, not diminishes, the prospect of nuclear war. I mean, it's simple. The existence of them means the war's more likely. If it is, it's the end for humanity. Let's be clear about this. Right? The idea that Jeremy Corbyn is insane for saying he wouldn't... I mean, actually, the real question is who the hell would press the button on this thing? It's the end if that ever takes place. Britain's possession of them also increases the likelihood of more states getting them. What was the great lesson of Iraq? Do you know why they invaded Iraq? Because they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. If they had, they wouldn't have invaded. What that says is to every other state, if you want to protect yourself against foreign invasion, you better get one of these nuclear weapons. It encourages other states to get these. It's also worth noting it's not particularly independent either. The missiles are manufactured at a place called Kings Bay in Georgia, the United States. They also do the maintenance on the subs. The British subs had to go to Georgia in the US for maintenance. The missiles are not only manufactured, they're leased to Britain. Right? Dennis Healey, who died recently, the old Labour Party, I mean, he supported nuclear weapons and the rest of it, but he had the honesty to say, when they first got tried, that they called it a rent-a-rocket programme. Right? If you actually wanted to launch, I mean, again, the idea that really it would be a British Prime Minister, hand on the button, with some idea of democratic, is a nonsense. It would really be a US general that would decide whether they're fired, because to fire the missiles, it's completely dependent on US navigation and targeting systems and so on. It's not an independent... It's a nuclear weapon with a Union Jack on top, but actually it's completely integrated into the US and dependent on the US military nuclear system. That's the reality. The real reason Britain has Trident is it's the price of access to the American military umbrella. And what that reflects is the solution to a big dilemma that the British ruling class has had in the 20th century, which was that Britain used to be the workshop of the world, with a presence and investments globally, with the British Empire and so on, but increasingly it found itself eclipsed by its rivals, Germany, Japan, trying to rise above all of America. And after the Second World War, it realised it could no longer defend its global investment simply through its own military power, which was in decline. And therefore it hitched its wagon decisively to this alliance with US imperialism, especially after the rout in Egypt in 1956. It said we have to cling to America. That's been the reality. The strategic alliance with US imperialism that Tony Blair was talking about has actually been a feature of every government, Labour or Tory, since the Second World War. What that means is the question of Trident, British membership of NATO, the US-led alliance, and questions like Britain's support for the US in Iraq and now Syria are not separate questions. They all come back to the strategic decision about how best to defend British capitalist interests on the global stage. I want to say something about Syria as well, because I think this is a question that's facing us all. We're all going to be asked, come on, what do you think about this bombing? Isn't that the answer? And so on. What's happening in Syria is horrific. The population of Syria was 23 million. Hundreds of thousands have been killed in a horrific civil war. There was a revolutionary upsurge, part of the Arab Spring, in Syria in 2011. The Assad regime has drowned it in blood by creating a sectarian civil war. Horrible situation. Half the population is now displaced. Huge numbers internally displaced, huge numbers in surrounding Middle East states, like the Lebanon, huge numbers, maybe 2 million in Turkey, and of course, tens of thousands of people now trying to get to Europe and to sanctuary and finding the door shut on them, the so-called refugee crisis. The real crisis, of course, is in the Middle East rather than in Europe, who could easily cater for people. 2 years ago, David Cameron tried to get Britain to join in the bombing of the Assad regime. He was defeated in Parliament. Ed Miliband, with the searing memory in the Labour Party of Iraq, hesitated. And to me, that little breach, he wasn't wholly opposed to it, he just said, I'm not quite sure yet. And that was enough for the kind of anti-war feeling in British society to go through the floodgates, and it stopped it being passed in Parliament. Because the legacy of Iraq is something that deeply troubles our rulers. Deeply troubles our rulers. The fact that millions of people marched, and the people who marched over Iraq feel vindicated. There were no weapons of mass destruction. People think we were right. That's made it more difficult for Britain to intervene in the world. The second reason is, and the British public has not been told the truth about this, is that the British intervention in Basra, in southern Iraq, and then in Helmand Province in Afghanistan, both involved serious military defeats. They went in thinking, you know, what was that idea that the West would sweep in, the Americans would sweep in, they'd be greeted with flowers, and so they were not armed or prepared for a serious conflict, and they were defeated. They had to be bailed out by the Americans. And therefore, what the British state and the British military and its politicians want to do is to try to re-legitimise, in the eyes of the majority of the public, the idea of British military invention. And the fact that people like us, our arguments have had a resonance, they want to push us into the margins. They now want to use Syria to try and do this, and we know what the arguments are now. But having said that they should bomb Assad, now they tell us we should bomb another side in the civil war, ISIS. And I think, and most disgraceful, they're trying to use people's incredible sympathy, brilliant sympathy for refugees, to try and say, therefore, we have to support military action. The Sun newspaper had a picture of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old toddler who died, and saying, bomb Syria for Aylan. Trying to use that humanitarian feeling people have to hitch it to the war chariot of Western imperialism. This is the argument that we're facing. I think all of us have to think about how we can respond to that argument. Here's just a few thoughts. I think, first of all, ISIS was born, above all, in Iraq. And it was born out of years of destruction, occupation that left 1 million people dead. ISIS, in my view, is a horrible organisation. It was born out of horrors imposed by the West. More bombing will just create more horrors. The US, actually Britain only plays a small role. The US has been trying to bomb ISIS for over a year. Very little impact. Except, of course, all that talk of precision bombing and we're just going to get the bad guys and all this stuff, it's not true. Right? When you drop bombs in the sky, sometimes they do things like one of the first waves of bombing in Syria hit grain stores that served a whole region in Manjib, right? Pushing people to the brink of starvation. Does that weaken ISIS, or does it push more people into the arms of ISIS and allow ISIS to say, we're the people opposing the West, look what the West have done? In other words, it can be incredibly counterproductive. What some people say is, but okay, I'm nervous about bombing and so on, but surely a no-fly zone. This is the kind of argument, a humanitarian no-fly zone to help people, as some kind of alternative to aggressive military intervention. The problem is this, who would this no-fly zone be against? ISIS doesn't have an air force. It fights on the ground. Who would this no-fly zone actually be against? Assad does have an air force. They use it to launch barrel bombs that have actually, if you want to know who's killed the most people in Syria, a horrible question to ask, but the reality is it's the Assad regime. Even today, the Assad regime is the much bigger source of bloodshed. But Cameron's not talking about, effectively he's talking about bombing their opponents, effectively putting us in an alliance with Assad. That's the reality. Of course, the Assad regime also does have a very sophisticated anti-aircraft system supplied by the Russians. The Russians are now bombing. We're told, of course, Western bombing is wonderful and moral. Russian bombing is a terrible thing that we must oppose, right? If you see increased Western intervention, surely, and therefore the different imperialist powers jostling over Syria, it both stokes further tensions, and there are no easy answers in Syria, of course, but West intervention from outside imperialist powers is precisely the problem that exacerbates these things, but also the danger of the two rival imperialists jostling against each other with clashes and tensions and so on. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. And hypocrisy, this is an obvious argument we should all make, the hypocrisy. If you want to help the refugees, why don't you let them in? Why don't you stop people drowning in the Med or dying on beaches, in Turkey, or rotting in a slum in Calais in the middle of one of the richest countries in the world? Right? These are the kind of arguments I think we have to make. What the Tories, I think, realise, because actually I think the military contribution Britain would make in Syria is limited, what they really want to do is split the Labour Party. Thanks very much. They want to put pressure on Jeremy Corbyn. And they want to amplify the pressure that's already there inside the Parliamentary Labour Party. I'm sure people, Hilary Benn, who is the shadow Foreign Secretary. Corbyn was elected as Labour Party leader opposing Trident and so on. Hilary Benn goes on the radio and on the telly and say, we support Trident. We might support the bombing of Syria. Maria Eagle, who's the shadow Defence Secretary, is the person who said it was wrong for Jeremy Corbyn to have said that he wouldn't launch nuclear weapons. I'm sure people saw in The Guardian over the weekend there was talk, unnamed, but who was it? 50 Labour MPs might support the bombing of Syria. I think that we have to send a very clear message to Jeremy Corbyn. Don't retreat. Don't back down on these arguments. There's an opportunity to put anti-war arguments to a much bigger audience. There's an opportunity to put anti-nuclear weapons arguments in a way that we've not heard in 30 years in British society. I personally think it's a huge mistake that there's even talk of a free vote, where Labour MPs will be allowed to vote with their conscience and so on. I'm sorry, Corbyn got a 60% mandate. If Labour's a democratic party, all the MPs should be told they have to vote against it or they're out. At the Labour Party conference, there was an attempt to shift Labour policy to opposing Trident. The uncomfortable truth is that some of the big unions, including Unite, who backed Corbyn, manoeuvred essentially to scupper a vote, saying they'd vote for the renewal, and putting an argument about what about protecting jobs. Just on that, there are 7,000 workers at Barrow Furnace who work on the nuclear subs, essentially. It's not hundreds of thousands, 7,000. There's a very easy solution. All of their skills should be used to make wind and tidal turbines. Very, very simple. Actually, Corbyn says that. It's a very simple argument. No one has to lose their job. Actually, I don't even really think it's just about the jobs. I think it's some of the union leaders saying, we're not sure, this could be an unpopular argument, this is not how you get elected. And actually, not only is that a dangerous concession to the idea everything is just about, but actually we can win the unpopular argument over Trident if it's put. Therefore, I think there are huge pressures on Corbyn. In that context, I think it would be a real mistake for the anti-war movement to say, we used to take to the streets over Iraq and so on, huge numbers. We hold public meetings. And now we've got Jeremy Corbyn, we don't need to do that. On the contrary, I think we have to take to the streets, campaign and mobilise and put these arguments. And I think they'll be hard arguments, but we have to put them. It will also help Jeremy Corbyn stiffen his resolve against the pressures that he's facing. Therefore, I think we have to rebuild Stop the War, expand that movement and put those arguments against the war. Final thing I want to say is I think there's something more to be said, though. Why do we keep having wars? Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, now Yemen, Congo for years, Eritrea. If you go to Calais, you'll meet people from Eritrea, some victims of wars, Western-stoked wars. In the 1990s, war returned to Europe, in the former Yugoslavia, ripped apart. In the 21st century, we now see in Ukraine a reasserted Russian imperialism and expanding NATO clashing and jostling against each other, an incredibly dangerous situation. Why is it 30 years after we were told the Cold War was over, which was a justification for nuclear weapons, we're now told that Britain has to remain a nuclear state for the next 30 years? Now, each of these wars has their own specific reason, and there are arguments, and you have to understand it. But the pattern is clear. They're not just a series of accidents. There is a drive within capitalist society for war. If you pick up I did A-level economics, not very exciting. Thanks. If you read the textbooks, capitalist firms compete by having the cheapest prices. That's the theory. In reality, they compete with any methods they can. Advertising, price fixing, cartels. But they also use military pressure on each other to carve out a better deal. There was a right-wing neoconservative Bush supporter in the 1990s who said, under capitalism, you don't just need McDonald's, you also need McDonnell Douglas, the biggest arms manufacturer in the United States. The drive to accumulate profits that drives capitalism also leads to a drive to accumulate the means of destruction. They're inseparable. They're entwined. Final thing I'll therefore say is, we make no preconditions about, if you want to oppose the war, everybody's welcome. Everybody's welcome. But if you want to root out the causes of war, you have to root out the causes of exploitation. And that means a challenge to capitalism. And for that, you need more than a Stop the War movement. You need a revolutionary socialist party like the SWP as well. Thanks.